So this is very enjoyable to be able to tell stories. And I was thinking about like what particular story I would tell, and I thought about the theme of the conference, that being that of time. And one story came to mind that it completely turns time upside down, the idea and concept of time. So I'll tell you, and it also connects to Pakistan, and there have been lots of requests from stories from Pakistan for some reason. So I'd like to tell a story about that. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And this is a story that is from around 1981 or 82. So I want to give you some context of this. In Texas, in the United States, we had, Sheikh Abdullah had built, with the help of so many others, a madrasa in the middle of like the hill country of Texas. And it was really an extraordinary place in that it was probably the first of, I think it was the first of its kind, where it was a madrasa community, where we had the mosque, but we had cells of living quarters where people could come, some married couples and some children, and then individuals who can come regardless of madhab or background, to come and experience a course on Islam from the different perspectives of the teachers that we invited from all over the world, but in an atmosphere that underscored the spiritual nature of Islam. So as part of the course of the practices, there was regular nightly gatherings of dhikr, and some people went on retreat, and we had Sheikh Abdullah was there, and many different shayukh came and visited us. At one point, we developed a trust called the Zara Trust, and that was a trust that would hopefully be in benefit of other people. And one of the focuses of that trust was Pakistan. And that came about because we had somebody amongst us who was from Pakistan and felt that with the talents that we had in the community, that we could do something there that would be beneficial to the people who went and the people who were there in Pakistan. So there was an initial group that was selected, and I happened to be in that initial group. And we moved to a small village in Pakistan, just outside of a place called Bahawalpur, in a village called Ahmedpurushakia. And it was mainly a very agricultural village, not much infrastructure. And people who were living there were mainly involved in the cotton industry, and also growing cauliflower and more cauliflower. And I know I can say that because that's pretty much our diet, was cauliflower while we were there. There's no supermarkets or imported foods or anything like that at all. So we we actually rented a place to have a zawiya, a center for us to have dhikr, and we purchased some land in which we were then going to build a women's clinic to serve the women of the community who were really in need of medical attention, particularly on the gynecological side. There was a lot of kind of half-baked doctors and some people practicing local medicine who really didn't know what they were doing. So there's a lot of sort of barbaric things that were going on regarding women. And so we opened up this, we built the center, we built the clinic. And so while I was there, we heard about this sheikh that was coming. And his name was Sheikh Sayyid Ikram Hussain. and he was a Chisti sheikh, and we got to know him really, really well. Just to give you an idea, a flavor of the type of being that he was, the first day that we were invited to meet him, we came to a place that was like his Hanukkah, a building in which there was a private residence for himself, and the rest of it was an open area, had a covered area. And he was having a majlis, and in Pakistan, in that tradition, there was qawwali being sung, and there were people who were God intoxicated, just throwing themselves up in the air, and it was a wild scene, and people throwing money. There were people with stacks of money this high, and just throwing money at the sheikh, and the sheikh, of course, I'll tell you maybe another story, but all that money that I saw kind of falling all over the place was all being shuffled to the back, in which there was two of the sheikh's students who were then giving out to a line of the poor who were back there, and he made sure that not one rupee was left at the end of the day, that all of it was given away to the poor. So it wasn't really for him at all. And so when he saw us coming, he stopped the whole process. He just said, stop, and they all stopped, and he went into his room, and he asked that we all be brought into the room. And we got into the room, and we sat in a circle around him, and he was, dressed as a Chisti sheikh. They have a certain caps that Chisti sheikhs wear. It's called the Chisti cap. I mean, that's what the Chisti topi. And he was, wearing very simple clothes. And when he came into that room and he had it, we were sitting there, he took off his hat and he leaned on a pillow next to him and stretched his feet out, right? Now, I know that doesn't sound very odd, but to all of his students who were outside, who were peeking through the window, right, seeing why the sheikh had left and why is he sitting there now without his hat, with his feet stretched out, well, of course, we poisoned him, right? So the uproar went through the whole of his community that we poisoned the sheikh, because he wouldn't be sitting like that with people. He would be sitting in a more sort of dignified way, as he would with the other folks that were there. So they literally pushed the door open, made a big ruckus. They grabbed one of my friends who was in the circle, and they started questioning what's going on here and all. And the sheikh, of course, said, "Get out." He chased them all out. He said, "What are you doing?" And they said, "But look, you're sitting there with your feet stretched, your hat is off. What have they done to you?" He said, "Go away. I'm sitting with my family." So he says, and he's relaxed. So he sent everybody out, and we were all sitting there. Then he went around the room. We were sitting in a circle, and he asked us about Sufism. He asked us about our practices. And he then went around the room and said, what have you learned from being a Sufi, right? So there was about 16 of us. So he went around the room, and everybody, all these Americans, a few British, they didn't speak too much. But all these Americans were right there ready to say, "Oh, I benefited a great deal from my Sufi experience and about the nafs." And he was sitting there bored to death listening to. And he went around the room and asked everybody, he said, "What did you gain? Everybody had an answer. Then he finally got to, there was a young man who was I was his guardian. He was at that time about 16 years old. I was looking after him. And he went to him and he said, "What have you gotten out of Sufism?" And he says, "I have no idea. I don't know anything about Sufism." And then the sheikh looked at us all and he said, "He's the only Sufi in the room." So just, this is a taste of this incredible being, So we developed over time a very friendly, a very fatherly, in a way, relationship with him. When I was living I moved actually from this town to Karachi And here's where the story what I'm intending to tell you. We moved to Karachi, and I was there at that time with my wife, who, mashallah, she's passed away, rahmatullah alayh. We were there, and Sheikh Ikram was visiting us every month for about 10 days out of every month. And I was there that time for about a year. And we were really enjoying his company and so on. Anyway, my wife, she became ill, and she had something wrong. She was having a bleeding issue that wouldn't stop. So Sheikh Ikram came, and he saw what was going on with her. And he says to me, you must immediately go to the bazaar, and you need to get two things for her. One is 8 grams of afyun. You know afyun? Opium, right? And 8 grams of berberis, which is another herb, a bark, I think, from a berberis tree. And you need to take it and then grind it together in a mortar and pestle and make tablets out of it, dry that with tablets, the size of a garbanzo bean, the chickpea. And I said, well, Sheikh Ikram, I mean, this is not a very good, playing out good for me. I mean, if I go to the bazaar as an American and I'm looking for opium, that's not a very good outcome's going to come out of this, because I was projecting all this what I was afraid to do. And he said, no, he said, you go immediately now. Go to the bazaar and you do this. I'm going. He said, you had to leave. But when you come back with it, you will make these pills. So I really was reticent to do it, but I trusted him. And I've always trusted him, and I knew things happen around him which are inexplainable. So I went to the bazaar. Now in Karachi, there's a mosque called Karada, or an area called You know it, okay. And in that, it's a mosque that's surrounded with shops all the way around. And in the back of that mosque is a bazaar. And I'm saying this, giving you a note for effect, it was a bazaar. Let me have to tell you. Yeah, I don't know if you've been to it before, but there are very questionable things you can buy back there. And, it's in the dark area of the shadow of this mosque. So, but there also happen to be dawakhanas there, places where you can buy medicine. So I started looking around the first thing was on my mind was to get the opium out of the way. And I was looking around for police, of course, because I could easily have gotten arrested. So I went to the first dawakhana and explained to them what I'm looking for. And they immediately became very angry with me. And literally they brought a broom handle and they chased me out of the store with a broom handle. I said, okay, maaf, I'm getting out of here. So I left. Then I went to another one, and I got that kind of welcome from all the dawakhanas because they didn't want to get in trouble. So I was at a loss. I was able finally to get with the program, and before I'd asked for the opium, I asked for the berberis, and I did get that. But I still didn't have the opium. And then it was time for coming for Maghrib, and I'd been there for hours, having left that day on Sheikh Ikram's advice. So I I started heading out of the bazaar thinking, well, I just can't do this. Can't get this for her. So I'm just about to leave, and at around 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening around Karada, it's very tumultuous. There's vans and tongas and horse-drawn carriages and all. It's very tumultuous. So I was in the middle of this tumult, and all of a sudden I feel somebody pulling at my sleeve. And I was already having a habitual response, because in Pakistan you're constantly, somebody's pulling your sleeve for something, and they're asking for money. So they were going, I think it was, what did they say? Not bakshish. Yeah, bakshish. Yeah, they were saying bakshish. And I looked down and I didn't really see the person at first look. And I just said, no, 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 Maaf, no, I'm not. And then I looked at him and there was this beautiful old man, beautiful white beard with a chisti cap, sitting there on a white blanket in the middle of a dirt and dust. And I mean, everything was around us. And there was this, just the center of the eye of a tornado or a hurricane. Just total peace, total stillness. There he was. And he said, brother, sit down. So I immediately felt, you know, when things like that happen, you sense all of a sudden there's something going on beyond you. Something special's happening. So I sat down with him and he said to me, why are you here? And I started to explain to him and a tear came to his eye. And I said, well, what about you? Why are you here? And he said, now here's the thing about time. He says to me that last night, that was the night before Sheikh Ikram instructed me, because I'm in that day, to go to the bazaar. He said, last night, my Chisti Sheikh came to me in a dream and instructed me to come to this place and sit here and wait for an unusual happening. And he said, you're the unusual happening, right? So, and I just, you know, it was a very beautiful moment. And he said, what are you looking for? And I said, I'm looking for 8 grams of opium. And he turned out that he was a hakim, a Chisti hakim, Tibbi Yunani. He had Tibbi Nebawi and Tibbi Yunani. This is the medicine, the Greek medicine, and he's a practitioner of Greek medicine and the medicine of the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he pulled out, he had a black bag, and in Pakistan, they, like so many places in the East, he had a scale made out of brass, you know, the kind that you hold and it tips this way and that way with little tiny things to measure. And he held it up and he pulled out of his bag, a plastic bag, and I knew what opium looked like. And there he was, he pulled out a disc of opium and he put it on the scale and he put the gram things, and it was exactly 8 grams of opium. Exactly. And he took it from the scale and he wrapped it up and he gave it to me. And of course, being a stupid American, I wanted to offer him 50 rupees for it, right? But no, you know, that's not what was going on, you know. He said, no, I don't want anything from you. You know, he said, this is where my sheikh had ordered me to go and this is for you. So we stood up together and we hugged each other. And I don't remember, he never told me his name. I know I told him my name, but as the dark kind of came, it was becoming Maghrib, well into Maghrib, I got distracted by something and the next thing I saw was his back moving through the crowd and he just left me. But I looked at my hands to see if I actually had it, if it was, you know, if this wasn't some kind of like, you know, psycho moment that I was having there. But I had the 8 grams of opium in my hand. So I took the 8 grams home and I was touched by that whole experience. And I took a mortar and pestle and ground up the berberis with the opium with a little bit of lemon juice. I remember that's what he told me, and made little chickpeas and then let it dry a little bit. And he said to give my wife, I can't remember the actual number, 2 or 3 or 4 every 3-4 hours. So I gave it to her, and sure enough, within about 8 hours or so, her bleeding stopped completely, and she was recovering from this incident. The only thing is, she was high as a kite, you know. So I mean, so which I thought in this case it's probably okay, you know. So she was, and then the next day Sheikh Ikram came, and he saw her, and he saw that she was high as a kite, and he said, "Let me see the pills," And I showed it to him, and he looked at me. I'd never forget his face. He looked at me and said, "Too big, right?" He was because the chickpea in Pakistan is not the same as the chickpea in America. I mean, the chickpeas in the States are like this. The Pakistani chickpeas are like, you can hardly see them, right? So he told me to cut each one of them into 4. So I was giving her 4 times the dose that she had. But it worked. I need to keep it. So that's one of my experiences with Sheikh Ikram in Pakistan. And there are several others that if you were the fortunate ones to buy my book, that it's in that book there. And there are many stories about Pakistan. I'd like to share one other one with you. Again, kind of an extraordinary story. I was living at this time in Islamabad for about 3-4 months in near Mahala Road in F7. I don't know if people may know where that is. Yeah. And there, in that time, around 1981, 82, there was a thing called the Juma market, in which the Afghans used to come, refugees used to come and bring the rugs and other things there to sell to people and send money back across the border. So there was all kinds of things, jewelry, rugs, shawls, you name it, even food people were selling there. So I used to go there every week while I was living in Islamabad. It was so wonderful. So one day when I'm there, I'm with a friend of mine, his name was Abdullah Nouri. This man approaches us, just comes running out of the crowd, it's quite crowded, and he says, "Are you the Sufis from America?" And usually I don't like to answer questions like that, but I just looked at him, and he had a beautiful, innocent face. I said, "Yeah, I guess we're those Sufis from America." He says, "Come with me." It's like some movie, he just says, "Come with me right away," So he literally grabs my hand, and he walks me through the crowd, and there's a car waiting for us, engine going, driver in the car. He says, "Get in the car." And I said, "Okay." So we got in the car, and he took off, right? And we were sitting in the back seat. It was quite a large Mercedes. And we're driving through Islamabad. And then we get maybe 10 or 15 minutes. He was telling us, "You're going to meet the Sheikh. We knew you were here, and you need to meet the Sheikh." And I said, "Okay, we'll meet him." So we get to this house in Islamabad, and the driveway, and outside the house was a long line of women with babies. And a lot of them appeared to be ill. So it looked like a line of people waiting to come in for the blessing of the Sheikh. So we were taken right to the front. I mean, it just happened all like that. And we were taken inside of a room. And in that room, there was a charpai in the middle of the room. A charpai, if you don't know what it is, it's like a bed with 4 posts and a frame that's woven in between with leather, so that it makes kind of a bed, and then a mattress or a quilt is laying on top of it. And so in the middle of this room was a charpai, and in the middle of the charpai was like literally kind of a bump. And over the bump there was a blanket. And there were already about 6 or 7 people sitting in the room quietly. And they asked me to sit down. So I sat down. And the guy who brought us in there said, "Just sit, the Sheikh will come." And it was a very odd. I mean, we're all sitting there in this room with a charpai and a lump on the charpai. And there was very little in the room except for one huge Arabic calligraphy, which had a giant stamp on it. And I'll tell you about that in a minute. And we waited and waited. Tea was served. 40 minutes, 50 minutes, an hour passed. Nothing. Everybody else seemed to be quite content sitting there. And I was a little agitated. I didn't know what was going to happen, and I had other engagements that evening, so I felt, eh. Then all of a sudden, this lump on the bed started to move a bit, and I was shocked because it's either it's a cat or a dog or a monkey or a small child. I couldn't figure out what was happening under this lump, and all of a sudden this beautiful hand came out and pulled the blanket away, and there was this small human being. He couldn't have been more than 4 feet 5 inches, 4 feet 6 inches. He emerged from it, this beautiful being found his hat and stumbled around looking for his glasses. His glasses literally were probably about a half an inch thick. And he got up, and the man who brought me there said, "This is the Sheikh." And it turned out that his name was Sheikh Mahbub Jilani, and that they told me that he was 158 years old, and that I was blessed to be in this room to meet him. So we all were kind of awestruck by this incredible being. I'd never seen a human being look like this before. His hands and arms, I could see part of his arm, looked like parchment paper. You could see some of the veins in his hand almost through. You could see the bone almost. Face was very thin, and it was hard for me to conceive of somebody being 158 years old. But I was soon to be, my reticence to accept that was soon relieved by what I heard after that. So he saw us, and he called me up to he said, Ta'ad, he spoke Arabic, by the way. And he called me up to his bed, and he grabbed my face, and it was quite amazing. His hand felt like a little vice on my chin. It really grabbed it hard. And he looked at me and he said, Ente Irani. And I said, La, Ana Amriki. And he said, Amriki. And then he said to me something which just blew my mind. He said, you are the student of Sheikh Fadlallah Hayri, whose father was Ahmed Hayri. And then he starts telling me stories about Sheikh Fadlallah's father. Here, how is it possible? And he starts telling me that where Sheikh Ahmed was Sheikh Fadlallah's father, where he was in 1823, and all these things. And I'm just listening to this narrative, and I at one point broke into tears because I believed him in every way, and I was awestruck by how is it that here I am in Pakistan, get dragged from a bazaar, a Juma market across town, and here I am meeting this man who knows my Sheikh Fadlallah, and knows his father, and only saw me for a few seconds. So we had that one meeting with him, and he asked me to come back every day, right? And he also asked me to bring him 5 gifts every day, right? Oh, sorry. I want to edit that a bit. I called Sheikh Fadlallah that night and told him how I met this Sheikh. And he said, I have to check with my mother. At that time, his mother was still alive. So he checked with his mother about the dates that she would know that where her husband had visited in India and other places. And I spoke to him the next day, and he confirmed that those were the dates that his father was in India at the Jamia Masjid in Delhi around 1823. And that she didn't know anything about this Sheikh. That 19. Was it 1923? No, it was 18 something. Yeah, it wasn't 19, because he was 158 years old. So it was an 18 something. It could have been 1860. I lose track of what the number was, but it was a long time ago. And so I confirmed that with Sheikh Fadlallah. And then Sheikh Fadlallah said to me, every day, bring him 5 gifts. Now, imagine, what do you bring a 158-year-old person as a gift. So it was a lesson for me. Every day before I would go meet him, I would go to the bazaar and just buy him 5 little things. Like sometimes I'd buy him a Panjatan bracelet, or some plastic tasbih, or just 5 random things from the bazaar. And I would bring it to him. And every time I brought it to him, he took each single thing and he looked at it as though it was the most amazing thing he'd ever seen. He scrutinized every single thing. And every time he looked, when I brought him just like a plastic something that had the name of Allah or something that spun around, you get these funny things in Pakistan, and he looked at me and he said, Subhanallah, he just, to him it was a marvel. And so this went on, and every day he started then saving part of his dinner for me. And so when I would give him the 5 gifts, he would save me 5 teaspoons or spoons of his food left, and he would feed me like a little baby. He laughed at me every time. He just opened your mouth and put it in my mouth, and it was just sort of a very sweet, transaction with him. So I'll tell you a little bit more. So Sheikh Fadlallah then says to me, you must get his life story. Now, could you imagine what that would be like to get a man's story that's 158 years old? So I went to him that night, or the night after I'd received this instruction, and I asked him, I said, Sheikh Fadlallah has asked me to ask you we want to take your life story, we want to write a book about you. And he just smiled at me, he said, it's too late. And I said, what, why? Is somebody else taking it? And he smiled at me and he pointed at his shoulders, that the recording angels have already taken it. So he didn't want me to pursue it. And I asked him over a couple of nights if I could take his life story. He still refused. And one time I got a little clever, and I got a little Olympus tape recorder, with the small tapes, and I hid it in my kurta, right? And I wired myself up to my sleeve so that he couldn't see it or hear it, right? And I said, and I held my hand out, kind of trying not to be obvious. And then I asked him, I said, can you just tell us, something about your life? He wouldn't talk to me, right? He literally would not speak to me. And I knew something was up, because I knew he knew something was up. And I asked him, I said, Sheikh, is everything all right? He says, he told somebody to translate, he said, turn it off, right? He somehow knew that I had this recording. So I turned it off. And so I didn't get anything from him, except I found out on one of my visits there, when I was sitting in a circle around him, I would spend a lot of days with him, because he would sometimes just, his presence and his barakah and the people that were there were just an amazing group of people. One day, some 2 older men came to the door. Older, now it's a very relative thing to say, isn't it? The 2 older men came to the door, and the sheikh said they saw them fumbling with the screen latch, and they said, let the old men in, right? And they came in and they sat on either side of me, and I said, this is a tariqah of old men, it's just. So I turned to one of them and I said, how old are you? And he said, I'm 100, right? And my brother there, he's 98. I said, well, how do you know the sheikh? He said, oh, he's my father. And I said, wow. I'm telling you, this is what it was. And I asked him, I said, well, I'm really trying to get some story about him. And he said, well, we'll tell you something, but we know somebody who may tell you. So he said, there's a wing commander in Peshawar who's the commander of the base. He says, you should go there and see him and ask him to tell you about Sheikh Mahbub. So within 2 days, I was off to Peshawar, and I get to the air base, and I got permission to get in. I can't remember how I did it, but got onto the air base and asked to see the wing commander. And I get to the office of the wing commander, And it was just an ordinary Pakistani military office with a male secretary and the wing commander. I finally, about 30 minutes in, got to see him and sat down, and he looked like an ordinary Pakistani wing commander. Kind of had a Zeel Huck mustache and hair slicked back, but there was something odd about him. I noticed that he had like red strings tied around his neck. I knew something here was kind of not ordinary. So I asked him about Sheikh Mahbub. I said, "Can you tell me something about Sheikh Mahbub?" And he said, "I'll see if I can tell you anything." He says, "Give me a few minutes." I said, "Okay." So he left the room. And when he left the room, he was gone for a long time. The secretary had come and brought me tea once, twice. Time was going, and there was no wing commander. And I was thinking again, like, what's going on? Why is he not here? So after maybe an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, I'm just sitting there thinking maybe I should just go. And then all of a sudden, I feel the floor under me shiver, like shake. And I thought it was an earthquake at first. And then again, and then I got a little nervous, and the secretary, came in the room and looked at me like, uh-oh, right, and he closed the door. He left me in there. And then the room started shaking a bit more, and then I hear these clanging sounds, clang, metal clanging against the, chains. I hear chains rattling, and then all of a sudden the door busts open, and there's the wing commander, nearly stark naked, wearing an array of metal donuts all over his neck, his arms, his feet, connected by chains with a big metal cap with a spike and a metal spear, and a bowl, a begging bowl, a metal begging bowl. And he started, with all kinds of strings of color, and he started dancing around the room, saying all these chants of saying Allah, Allah, and he would just go and just danced around me for like 15, 20 minutes. And I'm frozen in awe of what's going on. I just don't know what's happening here. And he's just going into almost like a state, a frenzy. And he went on, and finally he just collapsed onto the floor in front of me. And then I said, "Are you going to tell me any stories about Sheikh Mahbub?" And he says to me, "I contacted my sheikh." Now, I learned later that his sheikh has been dead for about 70 years. But he went into some sort of trance and became in connection in some way, received this answer. And he looked at me and said, "There's no way that I'm worthy enough," he said to me, "to tell you anything about a man who has touched the ground of Medina and Mecca over 100 times. And I said, "What? 100 times?" He was silent. He didn't answer me. And the secretary finally came in and said, "You need to go now." And I left. Now, later I learned he belonged to some kind of group. They're called the Malang. And they practice this wearing metal to feel the heaviness of the dunya. And it's something that developed there in this part of the world, that they wear these things to experience that heaviness, and they do this practice in order so that they can feel free from it inwardly and not be sense anymore the outer weight of all the life that they live. So this is essentially the practice. So I went back to Islamabad, and I said, that man told me that Sheikh Mahbub had performed Hajj 100 times, or rather 110 times, which I learned later. And they said, yes, he performed Hajj 110 times. He said that when he was a young man and he was in Arabia, he was fighting against the Wahhabi group who were determined to destroy all the tombs of Ahl Bayt and all the tombs of the Sufis and the Awliya. If you've ever seen pictures of Jannat al-Baqi before the Wahhabis came and destroyed everything, there were beautiful tombs and places to sit and marble structures, and it was a place like almost a Gardenic place. But the Wahhabis insisted to destroy everything, including the wives of the Prophet's graves, the grandson, one of the grandsons of the Prophet, etc., just to destroy everything, and just to the ground, just leave a small brick as a mark. And so he fought against that, Sheikh Mahbub, and there was a warrant for his arrest. I'm telling you how he got to go to Hajj 110 times. He fought them, and there was a warrant out for his arrest, and that warrant was to bring him, to arrest him and bring him to Riyadh for execution, or to make tawbah or to change his ways. And so he was finally captured, and he was brought to Riyadh, where he was brought in front of Malik Abdulaziz, the king, the first king of Saudi Arabia. And he asked him, he said, look, he says, we have an agreement with the Wahhabis. You can't fight us for this reason. You have to renege and not do this anymore. If you don't do it anymore, we'll spare your life. If you insist upon these behaviors, then we have to execute you. So he said, do you have anything to say? So Sheikh Mahbub recited a poem, and clearly Malik Abdulaziz was moved, and his eyes became tearful. It turned out that the poem was about love of the awliya, love of Ahl Bayt, and it was a poem that his mother used to read to the king before he went to sleep every night. So he just said, I said, unwrap his head, bring him to me. He said, I don't ask you anything anymore. You'll have to then deal directly with the Wahhabis themselves. But for me, when you read this, he said, it touched my heart. And I'll give you, he says, you will be from this day forward a guest of the kingdom on Hajj every year for the rest of your life. Of course, he didn't know what he was getting into there. And that was the calligraphy that was on the wall that I was telling you about earlier. He had a beautiful calligraphy, and I looked at it this time closer, and it was signed by Malik Abdulaziz. It had his stamp on it, and in Arabic it said that Sheikh Mahbub al-Jalani, etc., will be as a guest of the kingdom for the rest of his life on Hajj. And he turned out that he made Hajj 110 times. An extraordinary human being. I left him and went back to the States for a while. And when I came back, I came to see him. And it was this time he was about 163, and he had passed away 2 weeks before I arrived in Islamabad, so I couldn't see him. But I have a document that I did some research on him, and around 1980s, some of his family brought him to Germany to do a special scan of his body, because he was not feeling entirely well, but of course, 158, 160. They brought him there, and they did a scan of his body, and they have a record of him that he had to be way over 100 years because of the body scan. They did a calcium scan of his body, and they looked at his organs, and it was indicative of a person way over 100 years old. They only had a few to compare it to, people that were 108, 109, 110, but this man was still kicking and alive and fresh, and at least from that scan, we knew he was way, way over 100 years old. So, Bismillah. So that's, another story from Pakistan. How are we doing on time?
You have a minute. Think it was the coordinates of
Another 25 minutes. Okay, I'll tell one more story, and then we end it there. Bismillah. This is going to be a little bit difficult to follow, because I'm going to go back and forth in time a little bit. And by the way, the reason I mentioned the first story about time is that the sheikh who had the vision of his sheikh the night before, right? And I was told to go to the bazaar the next day where he was to meet me. This is an interesting thing to ponder about time, the nature of time. This too has something to, in a way, connected with time. So I was in, there was in Manchester, I think, or in Leeds, in England, there was a Sufi there. His name was Sufi Abdullah. I don't know if any of you have heard of him. Heard of him before? Yes, he's contemporary. He died. No. He was a Pakistani. Beautiful, tall man. Had a huge community of people. They were all, I don't know what tariqah they belonged to. It doesn't really matter. But every year they had an urs. And Sufi Abdullah, led the urs. And like literally thousands of people came from Birmingham, Leeds. And it was in a big field and there was food. People were stirring in big pot. There's big metal pots that they're like 4 feet high, 5 feet high. And they used to stir it with a boat oar. I'm not kidding, with a boat oar. It's called a daig? It's amazing. It is amazing. When I was in Lahore at Data Sab, they have ones that they have a ladder. You have to climb up the pot to get to the top and pour food in. And it's an amazing story in itself. Data Sab in Lahore, they have continuously been feeding people for hundreds of years. And one person told me, and I don't know if it's true, but I think it probably is that they never clean the pot. Ladies, don't get too disgusted, but I mean, they never clean the pot. They just keep pouring in new stuff as people bring it, onions, meat, whatever, and they just keep stirring. They brought me something from that. I had it. It was very good. But anyway, coming back to Leeds, and I think it was Birmingham, rather, there was this big urs, and Sufi Abdullah was the grand master of the whole thing. And at one point, there was this. We formed a giant circle in a park on a beautiful field, and it was a huge circle, probably about 300 people, men and women, and everybody was doing dhikr, and it was an incredible moment. But I looked right across the circle from me, in front of me, I saw a beautiful young man with a beautiful velvet hat. I can tell it was velvet because it just looked that. And he was looking at his hands and then looking at me, and then looking at his hands. And I think, what's he doing? And he's like looking at me very strange, like with beady eyes, and making this dua, and then looking at me again. So I wanted to find out what this was all about. So afterwards, I went to look for him. I couldn't find him anywhere. So I want you to keep that now in mind, that's one event. Leave that for a moment. I'm living in Norwich now, in Norwich, England, with the Sheikh Abdul Qadir's community at that time. We had quite a large community there. And I went to live there and to be with them and to learn from Sheikh Abdul Qadir and the others that are there. And I wound up really, because I spent a long time and I couldn't work, I wound up living in the mosque itself. And I lived in the back of the mosque where the coats would be hung up and shoes would come. And during the night, it was cleared out. So that's where I slept. And my job was to live there, was to take care of the mosque, be sure it was clean, and that the stingy areas were all clean and everything. And that was fine. But after a while, I realized that it wasn't, I needed to move. I needed to make a change. And I was 3 months living in this mosque. My clothes were tattered and I needed to get new clothes. And So I ask Allah every night, I said, please Allah, open up for me that I can find a way back. Because I had nobody couldn't go to my family or anyone to get me a ticket. So months went by, and one Jummah, I was greeting everybody, and all of a sudden this Egyptian man who I'd seen a lot of times always gave me a big hug, and it was really sweet. This time, when I was saying goodbye to me, he gave me a big hug. He reached into my pocket with his hand, and I felt that was very strange. So I had a reaction. I grabbed it, his hand, and he said, no. He said, don't look until I leave. And so he walked out of the mosque, and I reached in my pocket, and I looked, and there was a roll of 50-pound notes, about 700-800 pounds. Now, this is 1977. 750 pounds is a lot of money. And I'm going, whoosh, this is it. This is it. I'm gone, right? And I immediately went to the shop, got clothes. I didn't have any new clothes. My clothes were in tatters. Went to the train station, and I called up Sheikh Abdul Qadir, and I said, I'm leaving, and please don't try to convince me to stay. I can't stay here anymore. I need to go. Just give me one advice, your last advice to me. And he said, very kindly, he just said, go to Sheikh Abdullah in San Antonio, Texas. Well, that's where I got my ticket, and I went to San Antonio, Texas. I'm there for a year or two. I'm fast forwarding a little bit, until one day, one of my good friends there said, let's go and make Umrah together. I said, okay, let's do it. So we went on Umrah, and we went to Saudi Arabia. We landed in Jeddah, and we were going to take a bus from Jeddah to, first we're going to go visit the Prophet in Medina. So we went on a bus to Medina. Now, while we're in the bus, this is now years later, right? While we're in the bus, this guy behind me keeps coming up to my neck and breathing down my neck, right? And I'm wondering, what is this? And I keep turning around, and then he moves back, and I go, okay. And, I don't think he's strange, in the way that you wouldn't think about it, but I let it go. And then a few minutes later, I feel him again on my neck. And I turn around, and this time he keeps his face, and he's looking at me. And there was something about those eyes. And he literally, because there was no place for him to move to the side because people were standing in the middle, he jumps over the seat, falls onto my lap, and he looks at me, puts his arms around me, crying, and he's hugging me and kissing me, right? And I just said, what is this? Who is this? He said, who? And I'm looking at, who are you? He said, it's me. I said, who's me? He said, do you remember? He said, the Urs in Birmingham, right? The man who was sitting in front of you, making dua, that was me. I said, Allahu Akbar, that was you? He said, yes. He said, I'll never forget your face, he said to me. And so I said, what brings you here? How is this possible? He says, do you know what my dua was? I said, no, what was your dua? He said, my dua was that I asked Allah that one day I would be with you at the Rawdah of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And here we are, 2-3 years later, on a bus to Medina. He's there, and we're on our way to the Rawdah of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. It was a joyful, incredible, awesome moment. We're on the bus, and we talked about it, and we cried. And I said, look, we don't have anywhere to stay in Medina. He said, don't worry. He said, I have a good friend there. He'll look after us. So we get to Medina, and we get off the bus, and there's a Mercedes waiting for us. Big, beautiful Mercedes. So, well, now that's more like it, And we get off, and the door opens up to the Mercedes, and a guy comes out, and I'm just about to lose it right there. It's the Egyptian guy who gave me the money in the mosque. years before, in the same, more or less the same time. And he looked at me and he said, Mustafa, I said, and he was our host in Medina. And so I was with him and with this man who prayed to be on in the Rawdah of the Prophet with me. And there we were together. How did these things happen? You could not plan any of this. You could not conceive of it. They're happenings that in you, and I know everybody here has had experiences that inform them of Allah's providence over everything. That no matter what you think you know, no matter what you think you believe, and what rational processes, yes, they all have their due, but there's another X factor, which is unexplainable. Is that only where it says Allah brings the hearts together, that no one can bring the hearts, but Allah brings, and that's the truth. And it happens sometimes in a way that is inexplainable. And we had such a marvelous time together in Medina, and then later in Mecca Mukarramah. Anyway, these are some of the stories. Inshallah, you'll find them also in the book. But I want to, the last thing I want to say about all of this is, all of us have a story. And all of us, that story is an echo from the one and only story. Each one of us, life is a unveiling of the light and the intention of the reality of Allah Azza wa Jal to be known and to be worshipped. So it doesn't matter, some stories are fantastic, some bring inspiration, some maybe appear ordinary, but to the person whose focus is the path of Allah, is to be awake and aware, to be connected to the light within them, then each thing that happens to you in your story as it unveils as your life are stepping stones, windows, doors to your becoming more sensitive and resonance with the light that's within you. So when you hear stories like this, your story is as wonderful as anybody else's story, because it's each of us unfolding and unpacking so that we can have that acknowledgement and realization of that everlasting light within us. So that's it. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Maliki Yawmiddin. Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'in. Ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim. Sirata alladhina an'amta alayhim. غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون والسلام على المرسلين الحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم.